No one heard the first scream. No one knew the name of the first to fall. There was no news, no sirens, no mass funerals, only silence followed by a cough. It began in the shadows of ancient trade routes in markets, where cloth and grain exchanged hands and whispers of strange fevers passed just as quickly. It wasn't war, it wasn't fire, but it would change the world in ways neither empires nor kings ever could. What the ancient world witnessed wasn't just sickness. It was the first time humanity truly met death on a scale. It couldn't understand this is the story of Earth's first known plague. A forgotten killer buried beneath centuries of dust, now unearthed by modern science, long before the Black Death terrorized medieval Europe, long before smallpox scarred civilizations. There was the plague of Shuruppak, an outbreak buried deep in prehistory, hiding behind Sumerian myths and Mesopotamian clay tablets for decades. Scholars believed plagues were a product of crowded medieval cities. But archaeological finds from ancient cemeteries in present-day Turkey, Iran, and Iraq told a different story that pandemics are as old as civilization itself. The timeline takes us back more than 5,000 years to a time when humanity was just beginning to build cities, organize governments, and form the earliest systems of writing and trade. One such city was Shuruppak, a vibrant hub in ancient Sumer along the Euphrates River. It was here in the 3rd millennium BCE that something unexplainable happened. Entire neighborhoods were suddenly abandoned. Mass graves began to appear with no signs of war or trauma. Bodies were buried hastily. Bones showed no signs of injury, but traces of bacteria remained. What modern researchers found chilled them in 2011. An international team of scientists working with DNA samples from a mass burial site in the South Caucasus discovered genetic evidence of Yersinia pestis, the same deadly bacteria that caused the Black Death in Europe thousands of years later. But this strain was older, less evolved. It was in a sense the prototype plague, Earth's first known microbial killer to spread beyond a village and threaten entire regions. This wasn't just a scientific discovery. It was a rewrite of human history. Until then, the earliest known large-scale outbreak of plague was thought to be the plague of Justinian in 541 AD. But the DNA evidence now pointed back to 2800 BC, more than 3,000 years earlier. The signs had been there all along. Ancient Sumerian tablets mentioned a sweeping sickness that caused people to fall where they stood. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest recorded story on Earth, begins with references to mass death and the anger of the gods. But we didn't know what to make of it until science caught up with legend. Imagine what this meant to the people of Shuruppak. There was no understanding of bacteria or contagion. Illness was interpreted as punishment from the gods. Priests were summoned, offerings made, rivers were prayed over, and yet the bodies continued to fall. The city's vibrant life, its merchants, farmers, artisans turned into terrified whispers behind closed doors. Children disappeared. Markets' empty doors were sealed shut. Panic was no different. Then than it is now, only the explanations were divine instead of microbial. What makes the story more haunting is how quickly it vanished from memory, unlike later plagues that were documented in books, newspapers, and paintings. The plague of Shuruppak left behind only ashes, bones, and clay. There were no eyewitness accounts, only absence. Entire cities faded from maps. Entire generations were lost. And until just recently, no one even knew why the evolutionary story of Yersinia pestis also begins here. The strain discovered in those ancient bones lacked one critical gene, the very one that allowed later plagues to be transmitted by fleas. That means the first version of the plague likely spread through direct human contact, perhaps through blood spit or even wounds from battle. It wasn't as efficient, but it was still deadly, and it was mutating over time. That gene would evolve by the time the plague reached the Byzantine Empire. Centuries later, it had become a perfect killer, able to leap from rodent to flea to human in a matter of hours. But in Shuruppak, the battle was still new. The microbe was learning. So worry this plague left its mark in other ways, too. Some archaeologists believe the collapse of several early Mesopotamian cities, Shuruppak, Telbrak, and others within a 200-year period, wasn't due to war or drought. As long believed it was disease, silent, spreading, untraceable disease patterns in human remains show abrupt demographic shifts, fewer children, more middle-aged burials, and sudden drop-offs in population. This moment in time might be the birth of pandemic fear, the first time communities realized that their greatest threat wasn't an enemy army, but something invisible, unstoppable, and everywhere. As cities collapsed, survivors scattered with them unknowingly. The pathogen spread. What was once local became regional, trade became transmission, and slowly, the bacteria that would one day terrify the world found its legs carried by merchants, travelers, and war. But the plague didn't just take lives. It shaped belief. Ancient myths across Mesopotamia began featuring gods of disease. Temples began incorporating purification rituals, burning herbs, avoiding contact with the dead, washing with sacred water. These weren't just religious practices. They were primitive public health policies born from desperation and repeated through generations even now. Thousands of years later, we see echoes of those early fears when COVID-19 swept the planet. Modern people panicked in eerily similar ways, hoarding food, avoiding neighbors, spreading blame, and praying for answers. The difference: we had microscopes, they had myths, and yet the psychological impact, the helplessness, the confusion, the search for meaning remains the same in every pandemic, ancient or modern. The enemy isn't just a virus, it's the fear of the unknown. But there is another side to this ancient horror, one that rarely makes the history books. Humanity survived. They buried their dead. They left their cities. They mourned, but they adapted. The survivors carried new stories, new rituals. And unknowingly, new antibodies. Slowly, painfully, life resumed. New settlements rose. New gods were worshipped. And the first great battle between man and microbe faded into silence once more until now. Because now we are listening. Now we have the tools to read what the bones have always been trying to say, and they are telling us that plagues aren't modern. They are woven into our origin story. They are as ancient as the wheel, as human as fire. And this forgotten outbreak from 2800 BC was just the beginning. Centuries passed. Cities rose and fell. Languages changed, borders shifted, but somewhere in the soil the bones remained silent. Witnesses to the tragedy, no scroll recorded in full, and while the world forgot the bacteria, didn't it evolve? The Yersinia pestis strain found in ancient Shuruppak was just the opening note in a symphony of death that would play out again and again across history. Scientists studying its genetic structure discovered something remarkable. It lacked the flea-borne transmission gene known as YMT that meant it couldn't yet hitch a ride on rodents or their parasites. This ancient strain was raw, untamed, still learning how to conquer humanity. But that learning curve was fast and unforgiving as trade expanded across the ancient world from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley to early Mediterranean ports. The opportunities for the plague to mutate and spread multiplied. Every merchant caravan, every shared water jug, every battlefield wound became a chance for the microbe to leap, adapt, survive. In time, the missing gene would appear. The bacterium would evolve into a version terrifyingly efficient at mass infection, setting the stage for the first historical pandemics. We would come to name and remember. Fast forward nearly 3,000 years, and the world met the plague of Justinian, one of the deadliest outbreaks ever recorded, killing nearly 1/3 of the Eastern Roman Empire's population in the 6th century. But now, with modern DNA sequencing, scientists have traced a direct ancestral path between that Byzantine nightmare and the strain found in the bones of Shuruppak's forgotten dead. The plague had not just returned, it had never left. In essence, the world's first known plague wasn't a singular event. It was the origin point of a long, dark legacy that continues into the present day. That one early outbreak hidden in prehistory triggered a genetic chain reaction still echoing in the DNA of every modern epidemic. But the rediscovery of this ancient killer didn't happen overnight. It took the tireless work of scientists from multiple disciplines, geneticists, archaeologists, historians, and pathologists. At the heart of the breakthrough was a field known as paleogenomics. The study of ancient DNA using specialized tools, researchers drilled into teeth and bones, found in prehistoric mass graves searching for microbial DNA that could survive thousands of years. In 2011, a groundbreaking study published in Nature revealed fragments of Yersinia pestis. In Bronze Age remains suddenly everything changed. The assumption that pandemics were a medieval problem fell apart. The new evidence suggested plague had been haunting humanity from the very beginning, hiding in plain sight. This wasn't just a medical discovery. It was emotional. It was human. Imagine being a scientist holding the jawbone of a woman who died 5,000 years ago, knowing she was part of a forgotten wave of death that once terrified the world. Imagine uncovering the genetic code of the very microbe that killed her sealed within her remains like a ghost in the code. It forces us to confront something uncomfortable, that for all our technological advancement, we are still vulnerable to the same invisible enemy our ancestors faced, but it also shows how far we have come. The people of Shuruppak had no antibiotics, no vaccines, no understanding of germs or quarantine. They turned to priests, we turned to scientists, and still in moments of crisis, we all search for meaning, for control, for survival. In many ways, plagues don't just challenge our bodies, they challenge our civilizations. History shows that pandemics have often acted as reset buttons on human progress. The plague of Athens weakened the city-state during its war with Sparta. The Antonine Plague may have helped collapse the Roman Empire. The Black Death in the 14th century destroyed Europe's feudal system and gave birth to the modern labor class. Even COVID-19 has transformed how we work, travel, and connect, and it all began with Shuruppak. But what's even more fascinating and tragic is how little it took to start it all. One infected person, one poorly buried corpse, one crowded market, and a mutation barely visible under the world's most powerful microscopes. That's the terrifying beauty of histories. First plague, it reminds us that the smallest things often have the biggest impact, a single cell invisible too. The human eye brought down cities and carved its name into the memory of our species, and yet humanity adapted. Following the collapse of Shuruppak and nearby cities, the survivors didn't vanish. They moved, they rebuilt. The Sumerians evolved into Akkadians, then Assyrians, then Babylonians. Life didn't end, it transformed, because that is what we do best. Even now, scientists continue to unearth new burial sites, mass graves without signs of violence, but with the telltale markers of disease. Every discovery adds a new puzzle piece to the larger picture of humanity's first great microbial war, and each time we are reminded that this war has no end, only phases, only adaptations. So what does the first known plague mean for us today? It means that pandemics are not outliers. They are milestones. They are part of our human timeline, like wars or inventions. They expose what we fear, what we value, and how we choose to respond. It means that modern medicine isn't just a luxury. It's a miracle built upon thousands of years of silent suffering and survival. And it means that the story of Shuruppak isn't just ancient history. It's a warning, a reminder that the next great pathogen might already be here waiting for its moment, and like before, it won't announce itself with fanfare or fury. It will begin with a cough, a fever, a whisper, just like it did the first time. But unlike our ancestors, we have the tools, we have the science, and we have the stories, the ones buried in clay, written in bones, and finally heard across the ages. So the next time we hear of a new virus, a strange fever in a distant town, or a sudden rise in unexplained deaths, remember Shuruppak. Remember that we have been here before, and we endured, because even in the darkest times, even when the dead outnumbered the living, humanity never stopped moving forward. We built, we learned, we remembered. And that is how we win, not just with medicine, but with memory. Because the past is never really gone, sometimes it is just waiting to be uncovered.